Oh, I am just so humbled, man. We here at Encounter have been having a real rough transition with this move. We drove our U-Haul for 2 days across the country. We finally get to Arizona, to our new apartment, and it was nowhere near close to being done. And so we're kind of in limbo right now, living in a temporary place, living out of boxes. So you're gonna have to excuse the setup that I have going here. But it was much needed good news to check our channel and see it blowing up. We only had an internal goal of having about 100 subscribers in our first year on the air, and you guys shattered the barrier to a full YouTube partnership in like less than a month, which is astounding. I mean, that means that more people can access this free educational resource, which is just going to be more empowered GMs, more empowered players. And so to the over 3.1 thousand lovers of quality gaming and the 60% of faithful viewers who haven't subscribed yet, I give you all the sincerest thanks for rocking with us.
And now for something completely different.
So one-page dungeons, where do we start? Well, there are some knucklehead basics you have to know, and so I suggest you go back and watch volumes 1 and 2 if you haven't already. You can start building in any order. Some don't have a method, it's just an intuitive process for them. But for me, I find that the most practical place to start is the outside. This is the area that's immediately surrounding your dungeon. And when I say dungeon, I'm just talking about the playable mission area. Almost any location can be a dungeon. And the outside of your dungeon is your chance to introduce it. It's for the first impressions. You know, it's your dungeon's face, and first impressions are everything. You need a description, yes, but let some details be discoverable only by an active investigation of the scene. Random rolls might further add dimension to what you've already envisioned, and if you do it right, your players will have a vague idea of what they're getting into just from the context clues. You may have a bunch of teched out thugs with guns hanging around the outside of the area, or there may be signs of a recent gun battle and just, you know, blood trails leading indoors. In a fantasy setting, you might show traces of a dangerous beast or a monster, and this instantly gives a sense of danger and ratchets up the tension. Sidebar. In most cases, the outside zone can actually act as a part of the dungeon itself, providing a sort of challenge to the players or a sort of barrier to entry. And my two favorite ways to use it is either as a warm-up combat or as a skill challenge. Remember, this isn't an encounter to kill your players because you want them to make it into the dungeon, you want them to see the horrors within. So the goal here is to force your PCs to use resources that they'd rather not and keep the pressure on. And in case of my Glacier, I brewed up a little skill challenge, but you'll have to stay tuned to the end of the episode to see exactly what I did. But for your dungeon, maybe the first zone or the entry zone, the outside area, is a skill challenge to navigate a deadly neighborhood leading to your quest location, or a social encounter, and the PCs have to talk their way into the dungeon location. Make a note of possible outcomes, what will happen on a success or a failure, and then maybe you can use a combat in the zone, maybe as a result of a failed skill challenge, or it could be an ambush, a series of traps, but whatever you choose, the encounter's got to be quick. Like 2 to 4 rounds tops. Maybe no PC goes down, but maybe 1 or 2 people get close. Plus, a combat at the dungeon entrance can catch your party off guard. Like, they think they had a hard day and they're traveling all day and they think they're gonna have a long rest before they head into the dungeon.
Surprise, motherfucker!
You're already in the dungeon. So, of course, we'll remember our environmental storytelling, using our 5 senses to determine what is and can be observed, right? These kinds of details will make your area feel a little more grounded. This is also a great chance to intentionally mislead your party, though you have to be sure you have a reason for it. For instance, if the inhabitants of the dungeon are intelligent, then perhaps they're using natural or even magical means to disguise their presence. The party may see signs of a dragon, but they're really fabricated by a druidic hermit trying to ward curious adventurers away. Or on the flip side, maybe there's a really dangerous creature there that places traces of weaker monsters to lull adventurers into a false sense of security. Again, don't do this too much or without explanation, but done right, your players are really going to enjoy that your world is more than meets the eye. So here are some other questions that you may ask that can make things a little more interesting. Again, if you can't decide what content, if any, should fill this zone, then go ahead and use the method to roll for a focus pillar found in volume 2. Your entrance. And this is more than just, you know, the front or the back hole to your dungeon. The entrance can provide its own challenge if it's locked or not, and it's up to you to decide whether or not that makes sense for your dungeon. But this is also the time to think about secret ways in, you know, give your rogue an excuse to get info from a contact, or give your netrunner a chance to hack something. Secret entrances add an additional layer of interaction with your world, which is what gameplay is at its heart. Gameplay is the moment that players interact with your world and it responds to them. And we want to encourage that behavior. and rewarded. And we want our players to think outside the box. However, for a secret door to actually feel worth it, then the players have to know it'll bypass some sort of obstacle. If the entrance to the Arasaka building lobby, let's say, is unguarded, and the players find a back door that's similarly unguarded, then that is meaningless because it changes nothing. But if the lobby is guarded with electrical floors that the players can see snapping and crackling and popping, and there's a contingency of guards and robots patrolling, now when they find that back door, the players are going to be like, oh my god, ooh, ooh, because they'll be avoiding all of that conflict, and that will feel rewarding. Sidebar, it's okay to make some locations actually impossible to breach by frontal assault. You know, for certain locations, you should actually make the only way in the secret way in. Most players are used to kicking in the door, and most times that's gonna be fine. But locations with powerful magic item, wonderful loot, or boss locations, those should be impregnable by pure force. I would make so these locations are literally telegraphed as being crazy dangerous, and even the NPCs talk about how dangerous the place is. PCs may be able to kick the door in of any old gang hideout, but like the Night City Executive Bank, they should have robots, guns, and guards all but spilling out of the front doors. And you should mention those defenses every single chance you get.
This place is a fucking fortress.
There's security cameras everywhere.
Everywhere.
If your players decide to try it anyway, then you let them run into that wall and die if need be, because a frivolous death in the party can actually ratchet up the tension quite a bit and give your game that sort of Game of Thrones type feel. Again, I will warn you, this works best when you foreshadow the lethality of the dungeon. Like if a player truly feels like the GM reasonably prepared them as much as they could for how difficult the encounter would be, then it can take the sting out of death, though you should still expect your players to be a little sore about death, possibly at you, possibly for some time.
You killed me.
But that's okay, and frustration is okay. It's good. It's good because that means that your player is invested in the world that you're building. And this also gives you as the GM a chance to use that information to the secret entrances to the bank as a quest reward, perhaps for a completely different quest. If they find a map detailing air ducts or vents or whatever that bypass the bank lobby, then they'll value that information way more highly because the character has already died trying to break into the bank. So think about your dungeon's defenses. If it's protected, why and by what? And with that covered, we head inside our dungeon, and from here on I have to admit it is kind of hard to teach a step-by-step process, as the specifics of your dungeon will just highly change based on the location, the genre of the game, even the game system that you're using. But there are some general building blocks that remain consistent in any dungeon room, whether you're playing in Deep Space or Middle Earth. And focusing on these things first will dramatically quicken the building process. So for the interior of any room, I always start with size and shape. We're building an OPD, so we want to make sure that on our paper we have enough space for everything. So try to write neatly. I suggest using either one sheet of paper front and back or using two sheets of paper side by side. I use one side for room details, like writing things out. I use the other side for maps, diagrams, NPC stat blocks, and any homebrew items that I might come up with. I draw the map as I go, but it doesn't have to be perfect or to scale because these are just your notes. If you can read them, then you have succeeded. Note, these short one-page dungeons should be designed to be run theater of the mind because that's the quickest, easiest way to get your game up and running. Take the liberty to draw a wonderful map for your players if you want to, of course, but don't feel obligated. If your players really whine about not having a map, then I suggest you encourage them to draw their own maps or offer a map as something of an in-game item, as an actual inventory item, and then when they find that item, you give them a map. This is super immersive and it has worked to great effect in my own personal games. And when deciding the size and shape of your rooms, remember, there are 3 dimensions. If you have a highly mobile party, then I would consider actually building your dungeon vertically with the rooms stacked on top of each other so that your PCs literally have to fly or teleport to navigate. This can make it really fun if they have those abilities, but if they don't have those abilities, that could actually really ratchet up the tension because then any little slip could be a fall to their death. Rooms can also have incredibly flat, low ceilings, which limits teleportation in flight and can make combats really deadly for ranged fighters and spellcasters. So think about why your room exists, and knowing that alone actually will help you determine why the room should be the size that it is. It'll help you figure out what it should be constructed of and what should practically be contained within it. And within our room, we want to be thinking about interactables. What in the room can be used in a fight? What interesting reactions may be triggered when a fight breaks out? Interactables are things like improvised weapons, explosive barrels, weak beams or other supports, unstable floors, etc. And I suggest watching my video on brutal combats to learn more about building interactable spaces. And that's going to bring us to the enemies themselves. I mean, again, we want to be mindful of our placement, that it makes sense within our dungeon, and also try to avoid bad placement, which is what happens when you put your enemies in such a way that they become unfun for you as a GM to play as, or for your players to play against. Bad placement hinders your NPC's natural combat movement, such as putting a melee fighter in a deep chasm where they can't reach the party.
I can't reach the pilots, I can't reach anyone.
Or putting your range fighters in a tight enclosed area. Bad placement is also putting your enemies out of place where your party can't reach them, but they can still attack your party. Don't do that. Good placement means that your NPCs have a fair chance to use their abilities, but can still be overcome by your party in some way. So once our enemies are chosen, write their stat blocks on the page on the map. And I'm gonna severely abbreviate that shit. Like, if you only write down what you need for reference, that's good. If you have parts of the monster stat block already memorized, don't write that stuff down. Eventually, you might find that you only have to write down a couple of stats when you're building, and that's fine, so long as you understand. For our monsters in a D20 system, I choose a flat modifier to apply to all D20 rolls, and then I decide on armor, HP, give them 1 or 2 attacks, pick damage dice, annotate any special abilities, and I call these shorthand stat blocks MINION blocks. I use them for throwaway enemies, and they look something like this. You can use full stat blocks, but it's almost never necessary. However, if you feel so compelled, then I suggest you just print them out on one sheet of paper and put it on the back of your screen for quick reference. Now, for my personal favorite. Booty.
The most important thing in your life is going to be booty. Getting some booty is more important than eating food. It's more important than drinking water.
What does your party get for overcoming the challenges here? Decide this for each room and then for the dungeon as a whole. And be creative, Loot can be more than just money and magic items. And while you're building your dungeon rooms, don't be afraid to go back to a room you already finished and place an object that will help the party deal with a problem that you place further in the dungeon. That'll just make the location feel more interconnected, which is going to give a sense of complexity and depth. And that being said, you'll probably want to drop some gold, of course, and you should think about what your PCs can loot from the monsters that are within the dungeon. If your enemies are guarding treasure, now's the time to figure out what they're protecting and why. Loot can also be information, a clue or advice about danger in the dungeon. Perhaps they gain an ally from saving someone. If the PCs overcome the enemies or the bad guys in a non-violent way, then perhaps the NPCs give them some sort of hint to how they can beat a boss in the dungeon.
I'll tell you everything.
So just try to be open, can see what can serve as a reward. Maybe you reward your players with secrets. Secret doors, hatches, hidden loot. Determine if anything extra juicy should be hidden in the room and what it takes for the players to find it. It could take a nat 20 roll, solving a puzzle, defeating a certain enemy. I always just try to think about what could be hidden away, why it's hidden, and who hid it. Sometimes the secret is a result of an event. Try to make note of little scripted moments, gimmicks, tricks, or homebrew mechanics that you're going to use. Events can be triggered by certain actions or by certain occurrences, such as a room caving in if the column supports are destroyed, gas tanks exploding when shot, or a flock of man-eating, animals escaping their cages if a certain activator switch is damaged. These more or less scripted moments that only happen when certain conditions are met add some randomness, so that the OPD interacts uniquely with each party that plays it. These set pieces make the dungeon memorable, eventful, and cinematic. So remember, not every single room needs to have one of these special mechanics or scripted moments, but I always try to add at least one scripted event before reaching the boss, just to spice things up. And I know we've already covered a lot, pero hay aún más básicos. Construction. Keep in mind that the stairs, doors, windows should all lead to pretty logical places if you're in a man-made structure and it follows the basic principles of architecture. Now, if you're trying to make a trick dungeon or something more Lovecraftian, then your architecture can be as Dr. Seuss as you can make it. Also, resting. You want to make sure that your dungeon has at least one room for taking a long rest or healing wounds. I usually put a rest location about 3/4 of the way through to my boss, so if my room has like 4 rooms, then the resting location will be in the 3rd room after that room is cleared. Now, if you want your PCs to have a real hard knock life, then there may be no rooms for your PCs to rest in, and that is a decision that you can make, a valid one, so long as you don't accidentally craft a dungeon where the PCs have no place to recover and then they fight the boss after having 3 other combats and no rest.
I'm tired, boss.
You could actually wipe your party. So again, if your party can't actually rest in the dungeon, then ensure that that's by design and that it's no accident of bad design. Also, interconnectivity. How is it that your dungeon is connected? Not in terms of halls and doors, but in terms of the content, the motif, the themes, the mechanics. How are your rooms related to one another? Using environmental storytelling, earlier rooms may foreshadow what can be found in later rooms. You may have a puzzle that can only be solved by visiting each of the different dungeon rooms. Or perhaps there's a switch in one room that opens a door in another room, or a key found in one place can open chests in another. Rooms can also be connected by a shared theme. Like if the dungeon is some sort of elemental temple, you may have a water room, a fire room, and a lightning room, let's say, and they can all be completely isolated rooms, completely different mechanics, encounters, and everything isolated, but because they all share the same theme of nature and the elements, they'll still feel thematically connected. Also, enemies should be themed to match the location, and they should roam about the location too, and react to sights and sounds as realistically as possible. Think about how the enemies would interact with that space that you're building, and see if they would have any backup plans for if things go wrong for them. This will make your dungeon feel like a real place. Wow, that was a lot. But with these lessons learned, I swear that you will be able to build something cool and quickly. But of course, I've saved the biggest time-saving tip until the very end, and it's this. Don't build. If you're truly a busy GM like me, then I would avoid building at all costs and would religiously use these tools here. Here, you don't need to break out any charts, any dice, nothing. You can build your entire dungeon with the press of a button. There's a toggle to set the parameters, and you can click the button endlessly until you get something that you like. With a prefab dungeon made, you can then use your notes from the last 2 volumes to populate the prefab dungeon with those. Also, don't be afraid to recycle maps that you've already drawn. I do this all the time, and all it takes is a little bit of BAM! My players have either never noticed or have been too gracious to point it out, but simply taking an old map, even one I've already used earlier in the campaign, inverting it, rotating, flipping it, works wonders. Don't draw every location anew. You can take a dungeon wholesale, rotate, and repopulate. Suddenly, your ruined elvish temple is a dwarven mine. Invert that map, repopulate it again, and now that mine is a derelict ghost ship. So don't forget about the old maps you've already drawn. They can be perfect for the OPD you're making with just a little bit of BAM! So if you haven't done it in a while, I suggest you go out, pull out any old maps, and see if they can be reused. Same for digital maps. And that, my lords and ladies, is everything that I have found to be vital to quickly creating one-page dungeons, and dungeons in general. This concludes the season finale of the first season of Behind the Screen, which means that it's time for me to stop blabbing and show you what I came up with, utilizing the same methods taught in all 3 volumes. I drew everything by hand so that you can see how I organize my data, and your personal OPD doesn't have to be so fleshed out. I wrote this so that others could understand it, but your OPD can be way more gestural. There's also a PDF of the OPD, a gift for all of our subscribers who show us so much love. So please like and subscribe and leave a comment on anything that I said or I missed. A lot of good discussion does go on in the comments, so please join us. Your ideas might inspire someone, or you yourself might gain a point of inspiration. And if you desire to experience the depth of what RPGs can be, then look no further. I, the Brewmaster, am a professional game master, bookable through Start Playing Games. I'm offering a special discount for subscribers of the channel, so if you're eager to see my principles at work at the table, then there is no better way to do it than with Start Playing Games. And if you just want to support the channel, then please do so by joining the Patreon. We really want to improve our production quality for Season 2, which means getting some new equipment. And our Patreon is how that will happen. So if you want to be part of sustaining the work we do here or find it of any value, don't hesitate to throw us a few bucks each month. At the very least, it'll buy us a coffee. And again, thanks for watching. And I'll see all of you in the next one.